All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Adam Godet. I am a woodworker here in Washington, D.C., and a maker neighbor at the Georgetown University Maker Hub. This morning, I'm going to talk about screws. And if you haven't already checked it out, we have other videos on wood science and sharpening your tools. So without any further ado, I'll jump right in. Screws are really commonly used. Some of you may be familiar with them, so some of this might be like a little bit new here and there. Some of you may not be at all familiar with them, so I'm going to approach this as though you've had very little experience with screws and talk about some of the finer details that I think will be interesting to everybody. So basically, screws work on the principle of an inclined plane, which hopefully most of you used or learned at some point in your early scientific education. It's one of the 6 simple machines they identified back in the Renaissance. So it's basically just an inclined plane, or like a wedge, that's actually wrapped around a cylinder. And so when you look at a screw up close, you can see that fact. And so that inclined plane, like a wedge, pulls the fibers of the wood together, and that's how the boards adhere to each other. So it's a relatively simple principle. There are a lot of things that can go wrong when you use screws, though, and we're going to talk about some of that today. We're going to talk about how to do it cleanly, how to do it well, and the different kinds of screws to use for different kinds of jobs. So the 2 main screws that you'll find, well, first of all, I should say that there's metal screws, wood screws, and drywall screws. And if we're putting pieces of wood together, we obviously want to be using wood screws. And wood screws are identifiable usually by this sort of zinc color. So you can see that it's just kind of your standard, like bright, shiny metal. Drywall screws are sometimes used by folks because they're really inexpensive, and you can buy like a big box of them for a few bucks. Drywall screws look kind of like this. So put a piece of paper behind this so you can see better, or a piece of wood would be better yet. Drywall screws have this like sort of black metallic gunmetal color. And drywall screws are fine for drywall. They're obviously designed for pulling the drywall to a 2x4 stud, and they work really well for that. But what they don't have is a lot of shear strength. So the screw's not made to have pressure on it this way, perpendicular to the joint. And so if you're trying to hold something that has any amount of weight, or if you're sitting on something, drywall screw is really not the best option. So you really want to stick with wood screws. When you're working with wood screws, you're going to come across 2 basic shapes. There's a flat head screw that looks like this, and that's the head of it is flat on this top part. Obviously, it's tapered here. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you have a pan head screw. And they actually have 2 different purposes. A flathead screw is for putting 2 pieces of wood together, or for adhering something flush. A pan head screw is what you use when you want to attach something to the wood. So if you look at this washer here, this fender washer, if you put the screw on there, you can see that it sits nice and flush. It's a pretty clean look for, a couple pieces of hardware. If you were to use this flathead screw to attach this washer, you can see it doesn't really do the job. It's got this gap here between that tapered piece and the very top. And so flathead screw is not the right option for that. That's what you use a panhead screw. 90% of the time for the stuff you're going to be making in the Maker Hub, I'm going to guess that you're going to be using these flathead screws. Now, flathead screws are not to be confused with Phillips or flathead or slotted drives. So when you talk about a screwdriver like this, the part that drives the screw, that's a Phillips head. A flathead is just obviously a flat blade, or sometimes called a slotted screw. But that's just how the screw is driven. That's not the actual shape of the screw. So this is a flathead screw. Please remember that. Okay. Screws come in different sizes, both length and diameter. And the diameter of a screw is not really listed on the box in like a measurement that you're used to seeing. It's just given a number. And so about the smallest screw you're going to come across in a general hardware store is a number 4 screw, which is pretty thin. And about the biggest screw I've ever used is a number 14, which is, probably a little over 1/8 of an inch in diameter overall. Most commonly, the screw I like to use the most is a number 8 screw. And that's really common, and it's very good for, holding 3/4 inch material together, which is a really common shop size. So when you go to the hardware store, you're going to see the screws listed by that diameter size, and you're going to want to pick that carefully. If you use a big screw like this number 14 for putting 2 pieces of 3/4 inch material together, and you're screwing towards the end, as you inevitably will, the board's probably going to split. Even with pre-drilling, you're just removing too much material to really help yourself out there. All right, any questions so far? Okay, so are we still, do I still have folks on the line here? Lucinda's live, okay. Sorry for the interruption, yep. Don, you had kind of frozen there. So, all right, so we're gonna put two pieces of wood together. That's the main thing you do with screws. Number one thing you're gonna do before you start putting wood together, you're gonna wanna clamp the boards together in the orientation that you're gonna put them in. So I've just put a clamp on these boards here at 90 degrees, made sure that they're flush at the connection point. And when I go to attach these boards to each other, the first thing you do, a lot of people are tempted to just sort of like line up and drive this screw into the board. And that might work for you maybe, 50% of the time, but it's absolutely critical that you pre-drill your hole before driving it in. I talked about this being an inclined plane. Now, you know that a wedge is incredibly strong, right? You can push things that are incredibly heavy up a ramp that you could never lift. So you can imagine the force that a screw can provide on the wood. And this little, 1/8 inch size screw going into a 3/4 inch board is actually moving a lot of material. And that material's got to go somewhere, and that force has got to go somewhere. So if you just drive this in without pre-drilling, you're going to split the board and you're not going to have a good connection. You're going to ruin your material. So we're going to pre-drill. And there's a couple of different sort of finesse techniques that I will show you here as we go. So I'm going to move this off. I'll go kind of off screen and just get the workpiece on here. But basically, when you go to drill something, you want to make sure that you're coming in perpendicular to the piece that you're doing. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but you really want to make sure that you're not too far this way, too far this way. Oh, we got a little bee visiting us. Or too far in the up or down. So if you need like a helper on that, you can have somebody else spot you from the other side. Some drills actually have a level up here in this part that you can look at. I have a pretty good eye for this because I've done it a lot, but it doesn't hurt to have somebody else watch from the other side. And certainly here I have the camera, which can help, which you could set up your iPhone or something if you needed a spotter and didn't have one in the shop. So, and the other main thing is you want to try and get right into the center of the board that you're going into. And you can do that by measuring, or you can just eyeball it. Oftentimes, your eyeball is a better judge than you think it is. So you're just going to go ahead and drill into that. About halfway through, you want to keep going forward with the drill bit, but pull it out. And that's going to remove the material that's getting stuck in there. You can generate a lot of heat. And as you can see, the sawdust gets stuck inside the drill bit, and that's the cutting part. So you're actually just blocking the cutting part. You're just going to generate a lot of heat and smoke and not have a lot of fun. So we've gone in halfway, we've come out, we're going to go back in and finish it off. Okay, clean out your drill bit. Pretty simple. This is called face screwing, by the way. So I'm going to go through 3 or 4 different techniques on how you can screw boards together. This is the most utilitarian way. So in the shop here, I have a number of little shelves and cabinets that don't need to look pretty. You're not looking at them from the side where all the screws are. So if you're making something like that, this is a completely reasonable way to do it. If you're making a little bit nicer piece of furniture, I'm going to show you how to hide the screws later. But this is just for getting started. So back to the show. You can see here, we've just drilled, got a nice little hole. For a number 8 screw, easy to remember, you can use a 1/8 drill bit as your pilot hole. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and screw this in. This is actually a bigger screw than I need here. There we go. It's about 1 1/4 inch is a good size screw for these 2 boards. There. So I've gone ahead and I've put the screw in, and you can see that the screw sits a little bit above where you really want it to, and it kind of shows. It'd be just a little bit nicer if we could get that screw completely flush with the board. And to do that, you can use a tool called a countersink bit. And that's what this looks like. They also come like this. This is the fancier version. So this will actually drill your pilot hole and the countersink all at once. So this is a really nice tool to have. And I recommend we probably get some of these for the Maker Hub. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how this works. Basically what happens is this is going to drill the pilot hole for us and the countersink all in one motion. So I'll go ahead and line up again. Move this clamp so I don't injure my hand. So you can see what that does is it drills the pilot hole, and then it gives us space. It gives space for that flathead screw to go. So now when I drive this screw in, you can see that it's flush beyond the surface of the board. So it's just a cleaner look and generally considered a more finished approach to putting a screw in when we face screw something into a board. So that is the most basic way of joining two pieces of wood. You can see this is nice and rigid and would make a perfectly good 1/4 of a box. So as we move along here, the next thing I want to show you is basically the same technique, but with 2 extra steps. We can hide the screw in kind of a really attractive way with just a little bit of extra work. And this is using something called a button. So you can buy these pre-made, or you can make them in the shop yourself. You can drop them on your computer as well. But basically, this is just a piece of wood. It's a matching species, and it's a little circle. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create space for that circle to go using a forstner bit. And this is just a different kind of drill bit. And basically, it's got this cutter head that will leave a flat bottom on anything you drill. So that can be convenient for things like putting in hinges, or when you make space for doorknobs and that kind of thing. You often use a forstner bit. So these are really handy to have. And when we drill for these buttons, you always want to start with the bigger diameter drill bit that you're using. So in this case, we're going to start with this 1/2 inch Forstner bit. We're going to make a spot for the button to go. And the nice thing about that is that this Forstner bit has this little centering piece, and that centering piece is going to tell us exactly where we need to drill the pilot hole. Now, in this case, if we drill the pilot hole first, this little centering bit obviously has a point to it, and that point wants to be stuck in the wood. If it goes into the pilot hole, it's going to be a little bit loose, and we're not going to get a perfect circle there, which is what we want so that our button fits nice and cleanly. So I'll go ahead and change out the drill bit here. Depending on the kind of drill you have, sometimes you can do that just by using your hand like I did. Sometimes it has a chuck that goes with it. If you're using a corded drill, you don't want to do what I just did with your hands because it's too powerful and you could injure yourself. But with a battery operated drill, this is how they're actually intended to be used. So I'll go ahead and pan back down here. So just like I did before, I'm going to line up the drill bit. I'm going to tap these pieces so they're nice and flush. Your finger is a great tool for flushness. It has high sensitivity, a lot of nerve endings. So you can see that's a nice flush fit, maybe off by, you know, a hair of a millimeter here or there. Final sanding will take care of that. So here we go again. And I'm going to line up this drill bit. And I got a nice center hole here. Okay, so you can see that leaves like a nice circular big hole, and I will swap out the drill bit. Go into my Forstner hole here. Take another screw. So now you can see we've got a screw inside of a nice big hole there. And I mean, if you liked the way that looked, you could leave it like that. You can actually get pretty decorative screws and it would be out of your way. But what I would do in this case is take one of these buttons here. I'm gonna grab my glue bottle. So you take a little bit of glue and you're gonna put it around in there. Get a little bit of glue on this guy. And you're just going to tap it in with a hammer. So now what we would do is let that glue dry, and then we would sand or plane this flush, and you would have a perfectly flush, almost indistinguishable spot where you had inserted your screw. So that's using buttons to cover your screws. It's a really nice way to have a finished look on your project. So the final technique I'm going to show you, before I move on, do we have any questions there? All right. So before we move on, or as we move on, I'm going to show you what's called a pocket hole screw. And this is the most advanced technique, basically, that I can think of for screwing boards together. And basically what the pocket hole does is, if this is the outside of your piece, there's no buttons here, there's no visible screw, they're actually put on the inside. And we use this jig that I'm going to show you. It's a pocket hole jig. They come in different shapes and sizes, but they're all made by a company called Kreg, K-R-E-G. And I'll hold that up a little bit longer in case anybody didn't get a look. This is one of the more basic models. I don't use these very often, so it's good for me to have, but you can do a lot with these, and I know some woodworkers actually use these almost exclusively. In fact, if you go up into Pennsylvania and you shop at like the Amish furniture places, a lot of those cabinets and tables and stuff are all pocket holed together, and I guarantee you that's not the traditional Amish way of building furniture, but it is a very reasonable way to make a nice looking piece of furniture. And these are very accessible for beginners like us. So I will show you again here how this works. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to take the jig. Now, these jigs come with some measurements on them, and there's all kinds of instruction manuals online that can go in depth on these. But today I just want to show you very basically how this works, okay? So what you're going to do is take this jig, and you're going to clamp it to your board. And they come with their own clamps often, or you can use a shop clamp of any kind. So it just clamps on there like so. And you can see we have a very low angle to the board here. And that's going to be crucial to getting us these hidden pocket holes, right? The jig also comes with its own special drill bit. Now, this drill bit is very specific to the tool, so you want to make sure you keep all of your pieces together. And it has this little collet which locks in. And again, you use the jig, and this collet moves depending on how thick your material is, because those holes are only supposed to go so far into your substrate. So I'm going to go ahead and chuck this bit into the drill. Make sure that's nice and tight. I'll pan the screen down again. So here again, these holes here are to receive the drill bit, and this clamp is holding the jig in place. If I were in a little bit different shop situation here, I would also clamp this board to the table, but here I'm just going to hold it. So this is a do as I say, not as I do kind of thing, but clamp your work pieces to a workbench. So you can see here that the jig actually, you don't need to pull out the bit as you're going, as I did before to release the chips. It has this spot up here that does that for you. I'll move this down just a hair. So we're going to release the jig from the board. And you can see now we've got these two interesting shaped holes here. And we're going to take this board and we'll line them up. Clamp them together. Tap them flush. And now, this particular jig also comes with its own special screws. Now you'll see these are kind of like a panhead screw that I showed earlier, but these are their proprietary screws that they ask you to use. And these, I talked a little bit about drives. This actually has a square drive. So again, it comes with its own special driver. And you'll put that into your screw gun here. And insert the screw. And then the trick is to find the pilot hole that it drilled, because you can't quite see it. Okay.
Question, what if you use a different screw, like a non-proprietary screw?
They'll work fine. Remind me at the end, I'll talk about threads on screws. I actually neglected to talk about that, but that's a good question. You can use regular screws in here. These are convenient for a number of reasons. So let me go ahead and drive this last one. I'll come back to that. So you can see, again, very rigid construction there. No visible screw on the outside of either board. And on the inside where you're never going to see it, you have these relatively attractive little spots. You can actually buy with this jig these plugs to completely hide your work as well. And they slide in like so and can be sanded flush down the line, okay? So Lucinda, back to your question about using non-proprietary screws. You absolutely can use basically any kind of screw. These are very strong screws and they sell them for different kinds of woods, which is really convenient. So oftentimes if you go to the hardware store, you're only going to find a coarsely threaded screw. And those are fine for plywood and pine and other softwoods. And you can get by with them with hardwoods as well. But hardwoods actually usually like a finer thread. So let me grab some of those and show you the difference here. This side is a coarsely threaded screw. So you can see that the threads are actually relatively far apart. This is kind of your, this is your more or less average screw thread. And then this is a fine thread. So I'll hold them side by side here. So the fine thread just goes in slower and is less likely to break on you when you're putting it into hardwood. The coarse thread is great for softwoods, and it's the kind of thing that people use for construction and that kind of thing. So yeah, good question though. I meant to cover that earlier. I don't think it really matters on these if you use it. This is a panhead screw that they sell. I think you could use a flathead if you wanted. It's not going to make that much of a difference, but panheads are available and you can certainly buy them. And anything that you buy is going to be cheaper than their proprietary one. But they are really nice screws that they sell for what that's worth. So, okay. Any other questions?
Adam, I had a question. How do you pick like the size of the pilot hole to make for the screw?
Good question. Glad you asked that. So it's not exactly a science, but basically you want your pilot hole to be about as big as the cylinder of the screw. So the cylinder without the threads on it. So the threads are doing the work of pulling the wood together, but if you can remove the material for that cylinder, you're doing a pretty good job. generally speaking, a 1/8 inch drill bit works really well for a number 8 screw. And number 8 screw is the most common. And so that's a really easy way to remember. So I would start with that in mind. And then if you have a number 6 screw, you probably want to go down like a 16th or 2. And if you're using a number 10, you know, go up a 16th or 2 for your pilot hole. Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. Any other questions? That was the last demo, so we're fully into question mode here if you guys have other questions. Okay. Well, if you do have any questions, you can reach out to the Maker Hub on the Slack channel or through their group email, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Again, my name is Adam Godet. I have a company called Godet Woodworking. Website is godetfurniture.com. You can find my work there online. I'm on Instagram at Godet Woodworking, and I'm available. My work is available in shops in DC, primarily Shop Made in DC, as well as the Portrait Gallery Museum Store, the Neighbor Goods, and a few other small gift shops throughout the city. We have a series of these videos on beginning woodworking, and I hope you find them informative and helpful. And I really encourage you to get out in the shop and make something. Thanks for watching.
Actually, Adam, I have a question, I guess, kind of, one second, you can relating back to last week when we were talking about grain. So, like,
yeah,
we weren't there very long before we had to close down for COVID, but you remember the little, like, machine drill thing I showed you, the handy bot?
Yeah.
So, Don was there for that. One time I was trying to make something, and then, like, in the middle, the wood just broke, and Don thought because the grain was going the wrong way for the drill. I guess when you're like trying to do weird shit with a handy bot and not like conventionally doing stuff, like how do you like try to calculate?
Yeah, I guess you would just
grain and whatever.
You'd want to have as much long grain available as possible. So let me grab a board. So you'd want to have as much long grain available as possible. This is obviously a scrap, but again, this is your long grain way. So if you were setting the piece up, you'd want to have as much of this available as possible. With this particular board, I would set it up this way. This would give you a lot of opportunity for short grain issues, you know, depending on the shape. So I think probably if I were going to use the handy bot, I would try to rough sketch a shape. I'm a terrible drawer, but you know, if it was a person, I would, you know, maybe a stick figure and put that on there and then sort of think about where the material is going to get removed and where the potential weak spots would be.
Okay.
That would be one way to approach it. You could also use a plywood. Plywood would remove all opportunity for short grain issues or anything like that.
Does plywood come in blocks?
It doesn't, but you could glue pieces into blocks. So we could take, for instance, you know, these are 2 pieces of plywood. This one's about 7/8 thick. This one's 3/4. We could glue them up, you know, into a lamination, and we'd have, you know, about
Wouldn't the drill like peel them apart?
Would you be able to peel them apart?
Like, wouldn't like the drill in the project, like when it's spinning or whatever, peel it apart?
No, the glue would be way stronger than that. So if we glued these boards together, it would take God himself to tear them apart. You could saw them apart, you know, right on that seam, but yeah, the glue bond would be incredibly strong.